Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2022 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the competitive general nonfiction category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota. The general nonfiction category is sponsored through the generosity of the Duchess Harris Collection. My name is Jonathan Slatt. I'm a Minneapolis-based wildlife biologist and author with professional interests primarily in birds, mostly in Asia, and with a focus on the wild places of the Russian Far East. My 2020 book, Owls of the Eastern Ice, from Ferrer, Strauss, and Giroux, details my research with Blackison's fish owls. It was longlisted for a 2020 National Book Award, won the 2021 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award, and a 2021 Minnesota Book Award in this category. And I have the award ball to prove it. As we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land on which most of us on this panel recording are zooming in from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we all work together to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by first, Kim Hekela, author of Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. Kate Leibfried, author of Find a Trail or Blaze One, a biography of Aretha King, published by Beavers Pond Press. Jillian Peterson and James Densley, co-authors of The Violence Project, How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic, published by Abrams Books. And lastly, by Kim Todd, author of Sensational, The Hidden History of America's Stunt Girl Reporters, published by HarperCollins. Congratulations to each of you. I've been in your shoes and know exactly how exciting and stressful this process is. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round-robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. I'll then have a specific question to each of you in your wonderful finalist book. As a preface to our round-robin question, I'd like to share a quote from one of this year's Minnesota Book Awards judges in the general nonfiction category. As judges, we were tasked to read a sizable stack of materials and to assess each title along criteria of literary merit, audience appeal, and originality. All four of the books we selected have these in spades. Interestingly, in the panel's opinion, these four superficially different books share something else in common as well. Each really hit home and feels especially timely in today's zeitgeist. For a contemporary book like The Violence Project, perhaps it's obviously enough. It holds equally true for our finalist choices that cover historical subjects. Whether thinking about the recent battles fought by and against Planned Parenthood, or glass ceiling breakers of color like Vice President Harris, there are astonishing prologues and analogs in the books up for this award. This glowing quote is an excellent introduction to my question, which I hope each of you is willing to speak to. Would you agree with the judge that your book and the topics it covers are timely? And if so, how? Why did you tackle the book project you did when you did? What do you hope that your audience learns or takes away from your book that could be valuable to them now or in the future? I'm going to start by asking Kim Hekela to respond.
Right, thank you. Yes, of course. I think the subject of my book, Booth Girls, is certainly a timely topic as we watch kind of the rollback in terms of reproductive rights and access to things like birth control and abortion rights through attacks on Planned Parenthood, certainly. But I also, I really experienced the book and the subject through the lens of motherhood and adoption more specifically. And so I think the second part of that question is, why did I choose to write it when I did? And the answer to that is really much more personal than it is political, in that I chose to write it once kind of the dust had settled from my first book, which came out in 2011. By that time, I had become an adoptive mother myself, and my own mother had died in 2009. And so a couple of years after her death, I was still struggling with being a mother and what that meant for me. She had been really instrumental in helping me adjust to that. And I had time on my hands because I was done with my previous project. And I started thinking about her experiences as an unwed mother, quote, unwed mother in mid 20th century Minnesota. And realized that I hadn't asked her the questions that I wanted to, or should have asked her about that experience, which was highly ironic because I am a historian of women in the post-war United States. And I'm an oral historian to boot. So I had made, I conduct my research through interviewing women about their life experiences. And I hadn't done that with my mother. And so I decided that since I couldn't ask her those questions directly, that I would use my skills and training as a historian to try to understand her better. So I was able to secure a few grants to do some research in the archives and to conduct oral history interviews with other women who had delivered their babies under the shroud of secrecy and stigma and shame at Booth Memorial Hospital in St. Paul, and then surrendered them for adoption. So it was really a very personal motivation for me in terms of why I started to do it then. At that particular time. And again, I really, as I was becoming a mother myself, was really wondering what my mother's first experience with pregnancy and this kind of denied motherhood, how that might have shaped her mothering of me and in turn mine of my son. So that was really the motivation behind the book. But as a historian, I was also really interested in all these bigger questions because this was not a unique experience. My mother's experience was not unique. And then in terms of the takeaway, what I hope people take away from the book is that it is an understanding, not just of this history of the maternity home movement, of the extreme pressure and stigma under which these women who became pregnant outside of marriage at this time in history faced, but I want people to understand that history and our cultural and political context shapes the most intimate aspects of our lives. It shapes what happens in the bedroom. It shapes what happens after that. It shapes the decisions that are available to us to make. It shapes how we form our families, how we become mothers or fathers. So I think that's the biggest takeaway I want people to have from the book, is that we are not just autonomous individuals acting out our personal inner desires, but in fact, those desires and those decisions are shaped by the context in which we live.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Kate?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, I wanted to thank you all for the honor to be here and be among these incredible writers. I'm looking forward to reading each of your books. They're incredible topics. So my answer to this question is that unfortunately, the subject of this book is timely. And I say unfortunately because it's about punching through glass ceilings and progress and hope, yes, but it's also about the grim reality that racism is still here. It's still present and a major problem. And that has really come to light in the past few years. With COVID, for example, it really came to light that Black women and women of color in general were harder hit than most other populations in terms of unemployment, in terms of not having a safety net. But those are even more hidden manifestations of racism on a more visceral level. When I was writing this book in 2019, 2020, George Floyd was murdered just a mile away from my home office. And that sent ripples through not just my community, but through the world. And that came into play in the writing of this book. And how could it not? And you know, George Floyd's murder was seen as a big, shocking thing for a lot of people, but to those who were paying attention and to those whose families have been affected by police brutality, it was not a shock. In fact, it was par for the course. In Find a Trail or Blaze One, there's a story that Aretha Clark King tells about her own husband who was assaulted by police while gardening in his own front yard. So, of course, there are connections and parallels to what is happening today in the book. So that was at the forefront of the writing the whole time. So as far as the timing of this book, the timing was actually very intentional. I was hired by Metropolitan State University to write this book. Typically I work as a ghostwriter, but in this case, I was fortunate enough to get a cover credit. So Metro State hired me to write this book for their 50th anniversary celebration. The reason they wanted me to write this book is because Aretha Clark King was the second president of Metro State, and she was one of the first women of color to lead a public university in the nation. We're talking one of the top 5, one of the very first women of color to lead a university. And not only that, she transformed the school. She took it from its infancy. It was really an experimental school, and the history of the school is a whole other fascinating topic. But she took it from this school that was more of a concept and really struggling in some ways to becoming a nationally and even internationally recognized university and accredited university. And she was the ultimate networker and advocate for the school, and she really molded it into what it is today. So that's why Metro State chose to honor Aretha Clark King by writing this book. So regarding the takeaway, what I'd like people to take away from Aretha Clark King's biography. Well, first of all, I just want them to enjoy the story because it is an incredible story. I mean, she was the daughter of sharecroppers living in South Georgia. Between her parents, her parents combined had a 3rd grade education. And then she went on to become highly educated and highly acclaimed in chemistry. So I want people to enjoy the story, of course, but I also want them to read the subtext. It's not even subtext, it's pretty obvious. This battle that she faced was incredible, and it's still going on today. And I just want that to be part of the conversation.
Thanks, Kate. So Jillian and James as co-authors, so I guess you each get a stab at it. Let's start with Jillian.
Sure, thank you. So my own background, I'm a psychologist by training, but before I sort of became a psychologist, I was an investigator and I worked on death penalty cases in New York. And my job was to put together what we called biopsychosocial developmental life histories, which is basically just sort of how somebody gets to the point of committing a heinous murder, right? What does that pathway look like over time? And so when it came to mass shootings, which obviously is a very contemporary issue, they're happening all the time, they become routine in American society. It was clear to me that we did not understand who these perpetrators were. We didn't understand what this pathway to violence looked like. And because we didn't understand where it was coming from, the best that we could do was sort of put up bulletproof glass in our schools and run our kids through active shooter drills and kind of figure out how to minimize casualties, right? And so James and I decided to tackle this project around 2017 after the Las Vegas mass shooting, and wanted to really understand who mass shooters were, where it was coming from, why it was happening, who was being impacted, and really do this kind of deep dive so that we could develop solutions, so that we could develop prevention strategies to sort of intervene earlier along the pathway. And that was really the goal. But during our research on this, 2018, 2019, they were the worst years on record in terms of mass shootings in America. So it became even sort of more timely. I feel like we just felt pressure to sort of get this book out and tell these stories. We interviewed about, 50 or 60 people for this book, from perpetrators themselves to mothers of perpetrators, victims, first responders. And we were sort of carrying these stories for 2 or 3 years. And so we actually ended up writing the book very quickly. I think it was such a relief to kind of lay it down, right? And be able to sort of give these stories back to the world. So that was, I think, my motivation and why we sort of did it when we did it.
Yes, and I mean, that sort of answers the question, but one of the big findings that we talk about in the book is that mass shootings are becoming more frequent and they're also becoming deadlier. And so if you think about that in terms of the timeliness of the book, it was that we were writing it at a time where we were seeing this unfolding before our very eyes. And I think both Jill and I just become very frustrated with the public discourse around mass shootings as well, which was that you could see that everyone was sort of falling into their sort of camp in terms of how you interpreted these events and then what the solutions should be. And we just felt like there was a lot missing in that conversation. And what was missing was the data. So one of the things, in addition to the interviews and all the stories that Jill was just talking about, is that we built the largest sort of comprehensive database on mass shootings in the United States as the foundation for the work that was going forward. And so we coded about 180 mass shooters on 150 different life variables. So we started to see their mental health history, their childhood and their upbringing, their families, how they got access to firearms and other things like that, as a way of navigating this really fraught space, because it becomes so highly politicized that it felt like you couldn't have an honest conversation about the problem. And so we wanted to kind of cut through that, basically saying, here's the data, this is what the evidence is suggesting. Can we now move that toward a preventative framework for this problem? And I'll say just one other thing is, I'm originally from Great Britain, and this is a sort of uniquely American phenomena in some ways. And so part of my motivation for doing this work and writing this book was, if I get a phone call from my mom in England, 4,000 miles away, and she says, whoa, what is going on in America? I know there's a problem. That's a bellwether for something's not right. And it was the shootings like that occurred at Parkland, Florida, or Las Vegas, and so many, that my friends, my family were asking me those questions. What's going on in America? Why is this happening? And so that was another big part of the motivation, I think, for really trying to dig deep into this and to understand it on that level. And I will just say one last thing, which is to Kate. I'm a faculty member at Metro State. And so I love that you collaborated with the university on that project. I'm very familiar with that work and the work of one of our former presidents. And so that was exciting to see that. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, James. And lastly, Todd.
Thank you. I just want to underscore also what a pleasure it is to be in conversation with all of you and your fascinating projects. So when I started the project that would become sensational, Trump had just been elected. And it seemed like the only people who had the power to hold him accountable were going to be journalists and lawyers. And so it seemed like a very appropriate time to be digging into the lives of these heroic journalists who pitted themselves against corruption. At the same time, women's abilities to have control over their bodies were growing more and more restricted. And it also seemed like a good opportunity to take a look at how women, in this case in the 1890s, managed at a time when even writing about abortion and birth control was criminalized, and how they kind of wended their way through those restrictions. A longer term interest of mine has been the way that history, particularly the history of women, often holds up one individual as exceptional, as the person who is really, going against what society was saying at the time. So I knew about Nellie Bly, who was an investigative journalist who in 1887 pretended to be mentally ill and got herself committed to Blackwell's insane asylum for women. I see you guys are nodding and that you may have heard of her as well. And, she spent 10 days there and she emerged and wrote this amazing story for Joseph Pulitzer's The World newspaper. But what I didn't realize was that it was so successful, both her techniques and this very fresh, accessible writing style that she had, that editors all over the country started looking for women to do that same kind of reporting. And women all over the country started to think, well, this is something that I would like to do. So when I realized that there were hundreds of other women in the decade after Nellie Bly went into the asylum who were doing this kind of undercover investigative reporting, it really seemed like what I wanted to do was shine a light on them and their stories.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, so we're going to switch over now to the individual questions, and I think we'll kind of dig deeper into some of the themes that just came out. And I'm going to start with Kim Hekela. So first of all, I absolutely loved your book. The way that you blended your mother's story from the short stories that she wrote, plus the interviews with other women in the 1950s, and then your own story on the other side of this whole thing as an adoptive parent was I just thought it was very just a pleasure to read. And so, I mean, it really is. It's a deeply personal story, and not just because it's about you and your mother and the experiences of other women in this adoption cycle, but because at its core, I mean, this is a book born from a 30-year-old secret. And so how did the secret influence your mother's life? And how did the eventual revelation of the other Kim, not Kim Todd, but your half sister, how did that change her? And how did this unique writing project and what it uncovered change you?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it is a very, very personal book. And I have to say that at the outset, that was the appeal of it. After I had finished my previous book, I thought I would like to do something that has a little bit more personal meaning to me. And then as I got into it, I thought, what am I doing? This is way too personal. But there it is. It's out. It is what it is. So yes, for those of you who may not know, as I said, my mother got pregnant when she was single in 1960 and ended up delivering her baby at Booth Memorial Hospital in St. Paul in 1961, and then surrendering her for adoption and not saying a word about that for 33 years. Until my sister, who is also named Kim, came back into her life. My sister had hired a searcher and found my mother, her birth mother, in 1994. And that is the point at which my mother released her own secret and told my brother and me about our older sister, and started writing about it and talking about it more openly. So I think that, having held this secret, this major, pivotal and difficult experience so close to her heart for 3 decades, had to have affected her. I will point to Ann Fessler's book. Ann Fessler wrote a book called The Girls Who Went Away, came out, I think, in 2006, where she interviews women who had this experience from across the country. And I remember reading it at the time, and I gave it to my mom, and she read it too. And part of that book, part of Ann Fessler's book, talked about how this experience that so many women had had, mostly white, for various reasons, how that experience and that shame and the secrecy that surrounded it had affected them and their subsequent relationships with their subsequent partners, husbands, with their subsequent children, such as myself and my brother. And I remember reading that book thinking, yep, that explains my mom. I think she was always rather guarded in her emotions. She was guarded in terms of expressing or displaying affection with me and my brother. Now, how much of that is because of this experience with her first pregnancy, and how much of that is the fact that she's Norwegian and a good stoic Minnesotan, or how much of that is personality? I'm not sure how to tease that all apart, but I think it certainly had a huge effect on that. I think it had an effect on her relationship with my father as well. I think the next part of your question was, how did the revelation of the secret and Kim's return affect her? And so that was in 1994. I would say that just softened her. It loosened her up a little bit. She became, without going into too much detail, she became a much warmer person. She became a hugger, like somebody who gave us hugs. We were not raised that way. My brother and I joked that, like, this is a bait and switch. Who are you? Suddenly you want to hug us all the time, coming and going. But I think that was part of it. There were other things happening in her life that same year. In 1994, my father had Parkinson's for many years. He went into a nursing home that year. So it was this another momentous period for my mom at that point. And I think she was just reassessing a lot of things in her life. But I think it really softened her to have that child come back into her life and have it be a good experience. And how did this project change me? Well, I have to say it really helped me as I was grieving my mother's death. Writing for me is a way of externalizing personal things, personal stresses and grief in this case. And it kept my mother alive for me in my life, because I was doing all this research and writing about her and reading her own writing. So for almost 10 years, she was still really present in my life. So in a way, when the book came out last year, I had to kind of let go of her again. But it also helped me put my own family, the family my husband and I built through adoption, into a broader context. And that is both enlightening and uncomfortable, because it poses some really uncomfortable questions about the racial and class inequities that kind of underpin adoption, and in particular transracial and transnational adoption. So it was a very, very personal book, as you said.
I'm going to turn to Jillian and James next for the Violence Project. Again, this was a really difficult subject matter, but I think you guys did just a really a graceful job of navigating that, and especially the part about, I'm going to mess up the name, the no notoriety aspect of it, and really trying to focus on the problems and the victims and not on the perpetrators. And also the fact that your book ends with this is what we as individuals and as organizations and as a society need to do to confront this. I think that's really important for something like this. So my question for you guys, and I'll leave it up to you two to decide who wants to answer this, or maybe both of you have different opinions. So with respect to this mass shooting epidemic, you talk early on about American exceptionalism at its worst. And what do you think are the factors that lead or have led to this inglorious distinction?
So I think we see it on those levels that you just described, in that there are things that are going on at the kind of big picture societal level, and then there are also things that are going on at the individual level. And what's kind of interesting about what Jill and I bring to this conversation is that she's a psychologist and so really focuses on those individual factors, and I'm a sociologist and so really focus more on the group processes and the kind of big picture. And I think together they then help us see all aspects of this phenomena. So I think how we'll tackle the question is I'll talk a little bit about those more societal, sociological phenomena. And then I think Jill will chime in on more of the kind of individual sort of mental health and some other bits and pieces I think that are important here as well. So I think the biggest one, the one that everybody talks about and everybody always automatically points to, is firearms. And the minute you start talking about guns, you alienate half the room. So just by having this conversation right now, half of your viewers have switched off or hate me. And then the other half are cheering and celebrating. And that's the world that we live in. It's so polarized on this issue. But one of the things that we really try and emphasize in the book is that, yes, firearms are a proximate risk factor for the reason why we have mass shootings in the United States. And it is a major contributing factor for how disproportionate levels of mass shootings are, and gun violence in general is, in the US. And we go into quite a lot of detail on the statistics there. We do some countrywide comparisons and other things. But that's only one aspect of it. And I think what often gets missed is something about the nature of American society that also is a contributing factor here. So this American exceptionalism at its worst, the thing about America as a society, it's a very individualistic and individualized society. And what's great about that is that you can take a lot of credit for your individual successes, but it also is a really heavy burden on your individual failures. And it lays bare that if something goes wrong, there's an element of it's your fault. And it's part of that narrative around, we can pull ourselves up from our bootstraps and that we're sort of independent of structure. This sort of idea that we're not immersed in our history and our culture and everything. America's sort of told itself this fairy tale for a really long time. We call it the American dream, or we call it American exceptionalism and rugged individualism, and it's been packaged and marketed for generations. It's a central trope of Hollywood and everything that we do. One of the things we see in the lives of mass shooters is that these are often individuals who are in a state of crisis. And I think Jill's going to talk a little bit more about that in a few seconds. But the point being is that crisis often is a crisis of masculinity. It's often a crisis of not knowing where you belong in a society. And it's a crisis where you're trying to look for models of behavior to see where you fit in. And sometimes those models of behavior in American society are perhaps not the best ones, and may actually be leading people down the pathway toward violence. In addition, that crisis of masculinity, that crisis of identity, is sort of exacerbated by the stories, the myths of American society. So if you're a man in America who's not living up to what it means to be a man in America, you might want to act that out aggressively against others to reclaim your masculinity. And there's an element of that we see in some of these mass shootings, particularly mass shootings that are orientated toward minority groups, women, and others who are victims of these crimes. And so that's something that we write about in the book. But I think Jill will add a little bit more to that too.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think a few things I would add, sort of uniquely American, is one of the common factors that we found in the lives of mass shooters. So we found oftentimes their lives started with really significant early childhood trauma that was not identified, that these are a lot of families who didn't have regular medical care, who didn't have access to mental health, didn't have access to social services. And then as these individuals, typically men, got older, we see them enter this crisis. Sometimes it's a mental health crisis. It's almost always a suicidal crisis because mass shootings are suicides in addition to being homicides. They're kind of seen as this final act. And so we can think about things like access to healthcare, access to mental health care, maternity leave, things that a lot of other countries do to mitigate the impact of some of this sort of trauma and crisis that's actually we don't have access to as easily in American society. So I think we talk in the book about things like just increasing access to school-based mental health and doing trauma screenings in doctors' offices and things that sort of at a broader picture level would help with some of this individual childhood trauma and mental health crisis stuff that we were seeing. I think these mass shootings really kind of map on to increases that we've seen in other forms of deaths of despair in America. So increases in suicides and, addiction deaths. And we've seen these sort of increase over time in people in American society dying of despair. And this is one thing that I think we think mass shootings in some ways are a form of that. And then the other thing I would say is mass shootings, they're not just suicides. They are suicides and homicides meant to be watched and witnessed, right? There is this quest for fame and notoriety. The goal is to write your manifesto or your YouTube video or do something so your name is known, that your message gets out there. And so we all become these active players in this kind of performance that is a mass shooting because we're watching, we're the audience, right? And so that quest for fame, to be known for something, I think we can think about that with a lens of American society as well. That sort of need for kind of personal fame, to see your name written in the history books, even if it's for something horrible, that ends up being part of the motivation.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Kim Todd next for sensational, which I thought was fantastic. In some ways, it reads almost like a thriller, right? You have these women going in, doing these things that reveal taboos in society. So my question for you is, so for those unfamiliar with the subject of girl stunt reporters, which is presumably most, since the subtitle points out that we're dealing with a hidden history. So who were they? Who were the girl stunt reporters? What were their focus areas? Did their careers and treatment by their contemporaries influence investigative journalism as we know it today?
Yes, thank you for the question. So girl stunt reporters, as I mentioned earlier, were these investigative journalists in the last decade of the 19th century. And like girl stunt reporters, and I fought very hard to have the quotation marks in the title to show that I was not calling them that, was a retrospective label at the time. It was a retrospective label. So at the time, they would be more often discussed as being like sensational writers or people writing yellow journalism. And, this label is like a way of devaluing women's work, right? So you put girl there in the title and you put stunt there instead of investigation. And it kind of saps the power from what these women were doing. But what they were doing was that they were a lot of times going undercover and they were exposing societal ills. They snuck their way into adoption agencies, and many, many of them, including Eva McDonald Valesh, who worked here in the Twin Cities, snuck into factories that employed women and talked about the abuses that people faced there, from, stiflingly hot working conditions to sexual harassment from foremen. They went into doctors' offices and asked for abortions and talked about the treatment that they received there. And the resulting reporting, so use the first person a lot of times. The women really centered the experience of them going into these places to tell the stories, to talk about government and corporate abuses. And the other interesting thing is that because they were women and because they were kind of some of the first women doing this kind of journalism, they had access to women's spaces and these ills which affected women specifically, which hadn't been talked about in mainstream newspapers in this way. And unlike novelists like someone like George Eliot or the Brontes, who wrote under male pseudonyms so they would be taken seriously, they wrote specifically as women. They really talked about the effect of, you know, being in this freezing insane asylum in the case of Nellie Bly, like on, you know, a woman's body and what it was like to be a female in these given situations. So I think that they affect current day writing about in a number of ways. One is more negative, which is I think that because of the devaluing of women's work, a lot of young reporters still getting their start shy away from the topics associated with women because they think that the work won't be taken seriously. And that is completely borne out. That people who are really centering female experience in their work aren't considered the hard-hitting investigative reporters as you might be if you're writing Fast Food Nation or talking about war, which is kind of the ultimate proving ground for serious reporters. More positively, you can really draw a straight line from the techniques that they were using, which was these long form narratives that had scenes, that had characters, that had lots of dialogue, that used the first person, going undercover, to investigative reporting today, particularly the kind of reporting talked about as immersion journalism. And they really cracked open the door to that kind of writing and showed that it was marketable in an excellent way to really get yourself into a place and a time.
Okay, great. And last, it's to Kate. So you mentioned that you've done some ghostwriting in the past, and so while Find a Trail or Blaze One is not your first foray into this realm, you know, a living legend like Dr. Rita Clark King really is kind of one of a kind. And so, reading between the lines, you know, the reader gathers that the same holds true for this partnership that resulted in this biography. So, really, two questions. The first is, what did this collaboration look like in practice when your subject is someone who, to use your words, poured herself into the book project? And then the second question is, in addition to having the benefit of a living subject in a biography, your book also has this lengthy 20-page bibliography. And would you go over, please, the types of resources that you researched to supplement and contextualize Dr. King's own account of her life, and why exploring at this level of depth felt important to you?
Sure. Yeah, great questions. And yeah, when I say that Aretha Clark King poured herself into this book, I really do mean it. I have worked with many different ghostwriting subjects, and she has been the most dedicated, the most involved of any. So just to give you a little taste of that, my first interview with her lasted 5.5 hours. And you know, she's in her 80s. She is just a powerhouse. The 5.5 hours were not really my choice. That was all Aretha Clark King. She took me on a marathon, and I think I ended up with 30 pages of notes after that day. But I visited her frequently for about a year, interviewing her. And every time I met with her, she would bring out boxes of memorabilia. We're talking newspaper clippings, photographs, awards that she's won, just things to spark memories, and also just to give me some good information for my writing. And not only that, she is a natural storyteller. So she really had a way of bringing some of these situations to life, which was immensely helpful for me. And I mean, she does have this incredible story where she lived in a home without running water, in extreme poverty, daughter of sharecroppers. She was in the fields picking cotton when she was 11 years old. She was just in elementary school, picking cotton when she had to, and scratching out her multiplication tables in the dirt during her lunch breaks. So she, went from this life to graduating as valedictorian of her class, to going to Clark College and actually secretly majoring in chemistry was something that her mother, she was sure, would frown upon, and she was right. She kept this from her family for a long time. She graduated top of her class at Clark College. She earned a prestigious Woodrow Wilson Scholarship, which allowed her to go to the University of Chicago. And, it goes on and on. She has this incredible story, and every step of the way, she saved newspaper clippings and letters, magazine articles. She's kind of just a natural collector, and I think that might be partially because she was born on the heels of the Great Depression. Also, she was born into poverty, and having material possessions was a rare and beautiful thing when she was young. She recalls newspapers being quite rare in her community, and when people got their hands on a newspaper, they would pass it around until the ink wore off the pages. So I think part of the impetus for her collecting all of this memorabilia stems from her upbringing. So she really was a treasure trove of information, and so enthusiastic about the project. Now, regarding the bibliography, the 20 pages that you see at the end are actually just my major sources. So in reality, the bibliography is more like 43 pages. It might seem excessive, but keep in mind, I'm covering 8 decades of history. So Aretha Clark King was born in 1938. She lived through World War II, Korean War, which many of her family members fought in World War II and the Korean War, Vietnam War, war in Afghanistan. She not only witnessed the moon landing, but she was instrumental in contributing to it. She worked on a project for NASA as a chemist, and was instrumental in the fuel system for the Apollo rocket that landed on the moon. And she was in the middle of the civil rights movement. She lived in Atlanta just before the famous Woolworths lunch counter sit-in. She was in Chicago at University of Chicago when Dr. Martin Luther King came to speak at the university. She was teaching in New York and was dean of York College during the Vietnam War. And that, of course, made things pretty challenging because the students were seeing their peers going off to war. So it was a really fraught time at the university, the college. And she's a part of women's history too. She was blazing trails in areas that were largely dominated by men. So we're talking corporate boards. In 1975, when she was first serving on her first corporate board, 90% of boards were comprised of white, I should say, 90% of corporate boards were white males. So she was just, she stood out, but she was brave enough to take on that position, blaze the trail for other people who looked like her to come after her. And then academia, as a university president, she was unique as a Black female president. And then just corporate America in general. She was vice president of General Mills during a time when there were not many women of color in leadership. So she has many different paths, and she has done all of these incredible things throughout 8 decades. So I had a ton of ground to cover. And that's why my bibliography ended up being so extensive. But I enjoy research, so I actually found that part pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I think, for a book that starts out, as you said, with a preteen in a Georgia cotton field, and she, as she goes through her career, changes gears a lot, goes into different fields, but excels at all of them. It's, lots of people change careers, but to kind of go from the top to the top to the top, it's really something, really fascinating read. So thank you, Kate. Okay, so we're gonna kind of close here with the second round robin question, which relates to the first. So while all of your books, they are fairly different, at their cores, they share these themes of deep societal woe. There's sexism, there's racism, there's violence. Do you feel any optimism that by telling these eloquent stories that we as a society can better confront our pasts? And I'm going to start in reverse order, so I'll start with Kate.
Okay, sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And even though there were many fraught and difficult moments during Aretha's story, at its core, her story is one of optimism and hope and advancement. And she herself is a big believer in humanity. Rita is the kind of person who can walk into a room and make friends with everyone. She just has that skill. And she emphasized over and over again that she wasn't out in the streets starting fires. She was in the chemistry lab starting fires. So that's to say, she was a big believer in change from the inside. So over and over again, you see this with Aretha Clark King. She will get herself into a position of power, which is amazing in itself, but through her accomplishments and her hard work, she earned, university presidency and VP of General, all of those positions of power. Anyway, she would get to these positions of power and she would make change from the inside. And she did this over and over again through building bridges, making strategic alliances, and showing people that there are different ways of thinking and being, and maybe we can explore some of those different ways together. So just working with Rita and learning about her attitude towards creating positive change did give me hope. And I hope that the readers of her book will also feel that hope kind of running through the storyline.
Thanks, Kate. Kim, Todd?
Yeah, I guess I don't think of these as stories of woe at all.
Okay.
I find them really inspiring. If you take someone like Victoria Earl Matthews, who was, born in mid-19th century to an enslaved mother and ended up exposing the fake employment agencies trafficking Black women from the South and creating a settlement house to help them get a start in New York. Here was a group of women with no political power at all. They couldn't vote and they didn't have very many job prospects. And they forged exciting and meaningful lives for themselves using, their wits and gumption. I always tell my writing students that the career can be frustrating because there's no one path to take you where you want to go. But these reporters really showed all the places that creativity and stubbornness will get you.
Yeah, I think with yours, Kim, there's an anecdote at the end of your book where there's a writer's panel, and there's I forget her name. There's the woman who did the investigative piece in North Korea, and that just showed that that there has been progress, but a lot of this stuff is still ingrained in everything we do, and that's I thought that was kind of discouraging.
It was. So what he's referencing is this story about Tsuki Kim, who wrote this book called Without You, There Is No Us. And she went undercover into North Korea to work as a teacher and came out and wrote this book and was just completely treated dismissively by reviewers, by the New York Times, which discussed her book with, the title like Tales Told Out of School, like just like she was a memoirist who had gone for a lark to write to North Korea to Eat, Pray, Love or whatever. So yeah, it really showed that the differential treatment of people doing investigative reporting still exists for sure.
Thank you. Jillian James.
Yeah, I think, the last chapter of our book is called Hope. And you wouldn't think that you would spend, 3-4 years completely immersed in a world of mass shootings and come out feeling hopeful, but I really did. And I think in each and every one of these cases, when you look deeply enough, you can just see all the different places that if one thing had gone differently, if one person had said this, if one thing had been intervened at some point, it feels like it could have gone in a really different direction. And you saw that again and again. And even the perpetrators that we interviewed, we would always ask, is there anything or anyone who could have stopped you? And every single time they said yes. And oftentimes they said, probably anyone could have stopped me, but there was no one, right? And so I think for me, these feel so preventable after digging into this research that deeply. It doesn't feel like this inevitable thing that we just have to accept. It really feels like there's really tangible things we can be doing. And I think having the data that really brings people together around the data, right? We tried to write this book as nonpartisan and non-politically as we could, and just really strictly stay with what the data tells us, because the data is not political, right? The stories are the stories. And so I think it's a way that we can really come together and try to make some of these necessary changes. But even I found hope around things that we can do just as individuals, because I think that's where we get stuck. It's like the legislature has to do these things, and if they don't do it, then we're helpless. But thinking about what little things each of us can do in our own lives that we don't realize the ripple effect that we're having on other people. And that for me was a really inspiring part of it.
Yeah, I would say, we write a lot in the book about this idea that mass shootings are not inevitable, they're preventable. And that's where the hope comes from, that we feel like there is guidance now that we can all feel part of the solution. And it's the things that we can do just as an individual. We don't need an act of Congress. A lot of this just requires us to, educate ourselves around the issue and make those types of changes. And so that is a hopeful position to be in, because we went into this thinking, wow, this is really dark. And this is perhaps not going to be the light at the end of the tunnel, but it was a really, really uplifting experience, actually. I will also say that the time we spent with victims' families, survivors, first responders, like fundamentally changed us as human beings. We would spend weekends with families and, sit down and eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner with them and talk throughout the day. And it changes who you are. It changes your thoughts about humanity and humility and everything like this. And that was really, really powerful. And the only other thing I'd add on this is, if you think about Darwin had to go to the Galapagos because that's where the extremes are. And I think the study of really serious violent offenders, it's in the margins, it's in the extremes where you start to get at that humanity and that change and that hopefulness. So for me as a criminologist, that's my Galapagos. That it's the extreme that you're looking at, which I think tells us something about everybody, about our humanity. And that's where that hopefulness really comes from.
Thank you. And Last, Kim Hekela.
Thanks. Well, first, I would like to just thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And it's been such a pleasure to hear from all of you about your work and your books. And like somebody else said, I'm really eager to read them. Is there optimism for me in my work with this book? Yes. I think part of it is, again, on a very personal level. So, seeing my mother work through that, the long decades of that secrecy and shame and silence, and come out the other side of that, having established a really positive relationship with this child that she had surrendered for adoption so many years before, and seeing that in the women that I interviewed as well. Not all of their stories ended easily. Those reunions are not necessarily always easy or comfortable. But I think overall, yes, there is that story of hope and healing after this kind of secrecy and shame. But I want to make clear too that I am also a historian. This book isn't just a personal story about my mother. It's not just a memoir or a family story, but that there's something for me that is valuable, really valuable, in putting our personal, individual, and intimate stories into that bigger historical context. And oral history is a fantastic way of doing that. And I think that although oral history is not therapy for the interviewees, it can be therapeutic. And I have seen that in the women that I've interviewed, both for this book and my previous book, where giving them a chance to kind of recount a chapter of their lives or many decades of their lives that have been particularly difficult, but to see them in concert and in connection and community with other people who have experienced the same thing is incredibly powerful. And to understand that all of those individual experiences have unfolded in a bigger context, some of which they had control over, some of which they did not. I think I would echo some of the things that James and Jillian have been talking about the relationship between the individual and the structure that shapes our lives, between the personal and the collective. And I think for me as a person and as a historian, being able to understand that the world we live in today, in our most public and our most private ways, has been shaped by history and by people who have had agency to make change, to make decisions, gives me hope that I can not only understand my own life better, but that I can be that agent of change going into the future.
Great, thank you. So thanks to our tremendous general nonfiction category finalists and to all of you watching for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, April 26th. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 8 others are finally revealed. For the first time in 2 years, the Minnesota Book Award will be both live and in person. I'll be announcing the winner for this category. Please join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are just $22 inclusive of processing fees. Visit thefriends.org/MNBA for details. Thanks for watching and see you all at the library.